Okay, guys, so hope you're having a good day. Hope things are going well for you. Hope you're staying safe, making smart decisions, and obeying the governor. Now, I'm going to get into this lecture shortly. As always, I kind of keep you updated on what's going on in classroom and in my class in general. Now, for this week, all I have assigned were some Ed puzzle videos. And that's all I'm going to have you guys do this week. I'm not going to have you do any readings or anything like that. I might extend the civil rights unit into next week. I have not made that call yet. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Because really, we only have one more unit to cover. So I have plenty of things I can do with the civil rights era. I might have you guys take a deeper look at um, some documents, etc., etc., etc. So I have some things in mind. So we'll see. Now, as far as tomorrow, so I moved the lecture to today so that tomorrow, on Thursday, if you're behind on any of my assignments in classroom, you can go through and just get caught up. All right, if anything on Ed Puzzle or News ELA. Also, this is very important. If you have any missing assignments uh, before we went on break, and you want to get them done, you want to work on them, you want to turn them in, you can still do that. All right, all you have to do is email me and let me know what is done in the classroom. Let me know what you've completed, and I will update your grades. Okay, I will update your grades as long as you're communicating with me that you have completed the work. Okay, now we will be on quote unquote break on Friday. So that's Easter break. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. I will come back on Tuesday with an update, a weekly schedule update, and we will go from there on what we will be doing next week. Like I said, I might take the next week to delve more into the civil rights era. And then the following week, we would kick off our 70s, 80s, and 90s unit, last unit of the year. And actually, it would go up to the modern day as well. So be looking for that stuff. And it is crucial. If you have an F in my class, it is crucial that you get your work done. Okay, and I'll be reaching out to you as well. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and get rolling into the lecture today. So we talked about the ultimate goal of the civil rights movement, and that was to end segregation. And it was also to end Jim Crow laws, and also to fully grant the right to vote to African Americans, especially in the Deep South. There were a lot of barriers still in place. The poll tax, not the grandfather clause, but the poll tax and literacy tests were a big deal during this era. And they're going to fight. They're going to fight for their civil liberties, for their civil rights, to be full integrated citizens in the United States. Okay, so we did look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964 briefly, and that ended segregation legally, signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And then also the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which formally ended all barriers to voting. And we're gonna get to that. I always start with the end in mind with the civil rights era, and now we're gonna talk about their actual strategies and the strategies that were used to make their point, to show the government, to show the country that there was a need for change, that there was a need to to grant these full liberties and full rights to African Americans. Jessica Noonan. Yes. Quote, unquote. So we're going to get rolling into the strategies. And in my opinion, this is some of the most interesting times in American history. Now, when we are going through these strategies, these are non-violent tactics. The African Americans, and there were quite a few whites involved in this too, they decided we are not going to physically act out. We are not going to do this. We have to do this in a peaceful manner. And often African Americans and whites that were going through these demonstrations, they received training, and they were vetted, and they were tested and tried before they actually went and did these acts, these brave acts. Now, one other thing, I know I'm kind of in my intro here still, one thing to consider, not everyone wanted to do the whole Martin Luther King Jr. peaceful protest thing. Okay, the civil disobedience. There were others who were extreme. The Black Panthers. Forrest Gump, when he went to the Black Panthers party. And then also Malcolm X. They were going to advocate for change any means necessary, whether that was violent or not. They wanted change. And we'll look at them towards the end of this lecture today too. So there are going to be 3 major strategies that are going to be used, and we're going to spend the majority of our time today looking at these 3 different types of protests. You're going to have your marches. We kind of looked at the March on Washington a little bit, and they're going to march through Birmingham as well. We're going to see that that's not going to end too well, but it's going to show the country a lot of visuals that are going to show what's actually happening in these marches and what's happening down south, deep South America. You're also going to have the Freedom Riders. And we'll get into this now. If you guys go to the Memphis Civil Rights Museum, one of the buses that were burned to the ground, they're in the museum, and you can go check it out. I highly recommend going to that museum. I have not been there personally, but I really want to go. It's on my bucket list. Now, of course, quarantine and all that stuff, it's closed right now. And then also, probably my favorite one to study are the sit-ins. And we'll take a look at this. So basically, these African Americans, they made the decision to go to restaurants, establishments that served whites only, or African Americans had to sit elsewhere, somewhere else. They decided to sit there and just take it and make a point. We'll get to that. All right, so one thing to consider here, the majority of these organizations that are actually going to demonstrate, the SNCC, okay, they're gonna be heavily involved in this. Also, the NAACP, they're gonna be involved in this, but most of these demonstrations are going to be led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Wow, that's a mouthful. And this is comprised of whites and blacks, mostly college-age students. And also, we're going to see that they're going to try to register African Americans to vote. They're calling for desegregation of public facilities. These are the goals of the civil rights era of the movement. We'll talk about the March on Washington and the Freedom Summers here shortly. Now, this whole Black Power movement, again, this was the extreme to the civil rights era, civil rights movement. And again, they were going to try to make change happen by any means necessary. All right, so one of the first tactics of the SNCC and the civil rights movement sit-ins. We'll watch a video here in a minute. And basically, like I said earlier, if African Americans were denied service at lunch counters or restaurants, these African Americans, they're going to sit at the counter until they're either served, or arrested. Now, it didn't matter with the SNCC, white or black. They kind of sat together in solidarity, and they would show up early. To these facilities. We'll get a little bit of historical background to very, very famous incident here. But they were going to sit there, and they got a lot of abuse. Some, like these pictures here, some students, some people that were participating in this were humiliated. There were things poured on top of them, ridiculed, called every name, every racial slur in the book. And these were very successful, and they're going to show the country that, hey, there's a lot of discrimination going on, and is this really fair? Is this really fair to segregate African Americans from sitting at these counters or these restaurants? Freedom Riders. This is another tactic, and now this led to some violence, and we'll watch a video. Like I said, I found some pretty cool clips that go along with these tactics. I think you will enjoy them, and we'll watch them together. So blacks and whites, they're going to travel deep into the South. And these bus terminals in the deep South, we're talking like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, places like that, they segregate the bus terminals. In other words, so African Americans have to ride certain buses, and whites, they had to ride in other buses. So they wanted to challenge this, and they would ride together and target particular cities where they were going to do this. Particular cities in the South. And they were attacked, beaten, buses were bombed, and this was all in the national news. And that was the point of the Freedom Riders. They knew they were probably going to be attacked. They knew that they were probably going to be beat up. Now, they probably didn't know that one of their buses were going to be bombed, but they knew what they were doing. And they wanted to gather national attention by doing these freedom rides. Now, marches. Martin Luther King Jr., he's one that organized a lot of these marches, and they knew where and when to do these demonstrations. Birmingham, Alabama. So they're going to march in Alabama. They're going to use their constitutional rights to have a protest, have a march, and the police were not happy about this in the least. They were doing this peacefully. There was no violence. There was nothing going on here that was against the law. The police just did not want them marching in Birmingham. There's actually a really good movie on this, and I highly recommend it. And Martin Luther King Jr. is the main character, and a really good story. And the media was there. The media was documenting this. And when the police attacked African Americans, when the police were trying to break up this whole march, this brought about a lot of national awareness to discrimination in the South. And really, the African Americans were not doing anything wrong. I mean, the fire hoses being used, that hurts. I would never ever want to be hit by a fire hose, but I'm telling you that hurts, that can leave bruising, that can almost draw blood, depending on where it hits on the body. Also, dogs were used, and this is a very, very infamous photo that was printed and reprinted in newspapers nationwide. So, yeah, those are the tactics. They're going to march, the sit-ins, and the freedom rides. And they knew what they were doing. They were hoping to get as much controversy and hoping to get as much attention as possible. Now, this is the most famous march, I would say almost in history. This is one of the most famous marches in history and one of the biggest marches in history. And this is when Martin Luther King Jr., he's going to organize a huge march on Washington. He's calling for President Kennedy to support the Civil Rights Bill. He wants Kennedy to push Congress into writing a Civil Rights Bill and ending segregation, ending Jim Crow forever. So over 200,000 demonstrators, they're going to gather, and they're going to march on Washington. They go to the Lincoln Memorial, and this is where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his most famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And I assigned that as a news ELA assignment, and I believe I assigned it as a Edpuzzle video as well. So please, you've got to read this speech. It's excellent. You got to listen to this speech. It is powerful stuff. Also, another tactic that would be used, and this has to deal with voting in the South, the Freedom Summer. Again, just to kind of recap, in the South, African Americans were trying to be restricted of their rights to vote. Either poll taxes, where they could not pay the money to vote, or they had to pass a really extremely difficult literacy tests that were either near impossible or the texts were college level or higher, if you can believe that, where they had to interpret either their state constitution or the federal constitution. And this was a huge barrier. And voting equals power. Popular sovereignty, that's a term you will learn more about in government class, but voting is power. And if they could vote, if African Americans can vote, they can express what they want the government to do. And this Freedom Summer, they are going to target particular states, and they're going to focus on getting these African Americans registered to vote. And they're going to help them pass the literacy test. They're going to help them pay the poll tax. And we are going to see a dramatic increase during this time period. 400% from 66%. Now, unfortunately, there were 3 civil rights activists who were murdered during this time. 2 were white. So again, they're gaining national attention. They're gaining national recognition of what's going on in the South. And they were very successful with this. Again, it's non-violent. We're going to come back to these. I'm going to finish the lecture and then we'll watch the videos. There's 3 of them and we'll check them out. So ultimately, with all this pressure, all these tactics, all this mounting to a head, we know that Lyndon B. Johnson is going to pressure Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And he's going to sign the bill into law, and this is going to officially end segregation. The Civil Rights Movement was very successful with their tactics. They were very successful with bringing national attention to their plight, with bringing national attention to discrimination and Jim Crow and segregation and why it was wrong. We're also going to see the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a year later, is also going to be signed by President Johnson. And this is formally going to end all poll taxing and all literacy tests in order to vote. And this is going to be huge for African Americans and voter rights for African Americans in the United States. Also, the 24th Amendment, something else just to kind of briefly bring up, this is going to formally end poll taxes as well. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to do that too, but this is just another measure getting rid of this whole poll tax thing, this whole barrier. Now, we discussed the nonviolent tactics. We discussed how Martin Luther King Jr. tried to emulate Gandhi and civil disobedience and all that. But we have the flip side to the coin, Malcolm X. So Malcolm X is kind of an interesting figure to study in American history because at first he wants civil rights, the civil rights movement, the goals of the civil rights movement to basically pass and change any means necessary. And he's going to cry out for self-defense and black nationalism. Now, one thing about Malcolm X that's kind of interesting, he's going to kind of change his tune towards the end of his life. And he's going to say, look, we might have to do this a different way, a different route, the whole nonviolent thing. He was still an extremist, but he wanted to kind of step away from this any means necessary. And sadly and unfortunately, much like Martin Luther King Jr., he was assassinated. And both men, leaders of this movement. Also, you're going to see, along with Malcolm X, the Black Power movement. And they did not think the nonviolent movement was very effective or it was too slow. Stokely Carmichael, he was the leader of the Black Power movement, crying for black pride and power. And their big thing was racism. They're going to focus on racism across the nation. And they're almost like a militant group, and very extreme. And they're going to take those principles of Malcolm X, any means necessary, and be very, very vocal and try to make change at any means necessary. So, like I said, Martin Luther King Jr., he's going to be assassinated in Memphis. You can actually visit, like I said earlier, the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. And you can visit the hotel room that he stayed at. You could see what his hotel room looked like. It's actually a motel, by the way. You could see the room like it was the day that he was assassinated. And you can actually visit you can actually stand on the very spot where Martin Luther King Jr. Was assassinated. James Earl Ray. And little Missouri history, James Earl Ray, he escaped from the Jefferson City Penitentiary, and he escaped there and made his way to Memphis, and he plotted and planned to assassinate Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I'm not into conspiracy theories and all that stuff, but this one I do believe that he was acting on his own. You can do your own research and make your own determination as well. Now, also, just kind of, I want to bring balance to this whole conversation with civil rights. Yes, they achieved their goals, but there's a lot of violence, a lot of unrest in the nation at the time. And one of those examples was the Watts riot. And this was after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and this is in Los Angeles. And a lot of people are just not, I mean, obviously not going to be happy about this. And there's going to be a lot of, they're going to demonstrate. This is very similar to, say, Ferguson, Missouri, and what happened there. And 6 days, 34 people killed, hundreds of millions of dollars of property destroyed. So, I don't want to end the Civil Rights Unit on a sour note, because they were very successful with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965. Now, are we a perfect nation today because of these? Not necessarily, but we are a lot better off. We're striving to become better every day. There are still a lot of issues that we had to tackle and try to get better every single day as a country. Yeah, I'm going to show you guys a couple videos, and then we'll be done today.
The food was bland, the coffee weak, the atmosphere sterile. But the stools in this lunch counter are more treasured and more symbolic than any seat in a five-star restaurant. What was served up at this very counter was the sweet and satisfying taste of freedom. This was the main stage of one of the greatest dramas of the 1960s, the so-called sit-in civil rights protest. It was about 80 feet long and 24 inches wide, an L-shaped lunch counter that occupied the northeast corner of F.W. Woolworth in Greensboro, North Carolina. The countertop looked like elegant black marble or slate with polished edges, but this was a faux finish. Beneath the counter was a long piece of stainless steel for parking your knees or your old chewing gum. The stools were classic diner pieces, covered with vinyl, backed with chrome. One other feature of these stools made a lot of people uncomfortable. You could only sit on them if you were white. It wasn't an official company-wide Woolworth policy, but each store manager was allowed to segregate the counter if he chose to, and the department store giant was a landmark of Main Street America. So when four young Greensboro men wanted to challenge the invisible color line, Woolworth's was where they went.
It was by design that we came to this place. We wanted a place where there was really a dichotomy of offering and treatment and respect to people simply based on their color.
The date was February 1st, 1960. The four teenagers, freshmen at a local university, entered Woolworth's and began shopping for school supplies. It was a calculated move, meant to point out the hypocrisy of a store which would accept their money at the checkout, but not at the lunch counter. Receipts in hand, 2 by 2, they approached the forbidden stools.
All around this room, the bottom lips of the patrons were dropping, and people were just absolutely standing and staring and looking as though they were fixed in time.
McCain expected to be cracked over the head, hauled off to jail, or both. And sure enough, a police officer soon appeared.
And he started to pace the counter back and forth, and as he walked back and forth, he started to pound his nightstick in his hand. But after he paced 3 times with his nightstick, I said to myself, we've got him. He really doesn't know what to do.
The Greensboro Four, they would soon be called: David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair, and Joseph McNeil. The defiance and pride visible on their faces would be severely tested in the months ahead. Every day, the Greensboro Four and a growing number of black and white supporters returned to the lunch counter. Taking shifts, they occupied the counter stools all day, enduring insults and threats from hostile bystanders. With newspapers, television, and radio closely following the protest, sit-ins spread throughout the South. Segregated lunch counters in 54 cities were taken over by the protesters. Still, the management of the Greensboro Woolworths stuck by its guns, and the corporate bosses kept out of it. For 6 months, protesters and waitresses glared at each other across this counter. Finally, on July 25, 1960, the F.W. Woolworth Company ordered the Greensboro store to give in. Throughout the department store chain, the lunch counters were officially desegregated.
As time went on, it ceased to matter because you could come in around lunchtime and you could see alternating almost black, white, patrons, and nobody paid much attention to it. And you ask yourself, I did quite often, what was all the fuss about? What was all the mistreatment about? I mean, what was this thing that people were so afraid of?
The old lunch counter was by now an icon of the civil rights struggle. It became a ritual to come in and sit on the vinyl stools. In 1963, the lunch counter was reconfigured to accommodate more diners. One half of the original L-shaped counter was torn out and replaced with a horseshoe pattern. All the stools were recovered in pastel-colored vinyl. But one of the original long stretches of the counter was left exactly as it was in 1960. This photograph from the 30th anniversary of the sit-in was taken in 1990. It was the last time the Greensboro Four sat together at the counter. David Richmond died later the same year. At the same time, the old downtowns of small-town America were withering, and the old fixture, the five and dime store, went with them. The Greensboro Woolworths closed for good in 1993. But before the store was shut down, 2 8-foot sections of the surviving original lunch counter were removed. One was sent to the Smithsonian Institution, and the other to the Greensboro Historical Museum. The remaining 30 feet of the original countertop remains in place in the cavernous old building. The old Woolworths is being converted into a civil rights museum, and even though it is not yet officially open, visitors can drop by and actually sit on one of the famous stools. And thanks to what happened here in 1960, everybody is welcome to take a seat. The largest original portion of the sit-in lunch counter can be seen at the old Woolworths building, which is now the International Civil Rights Center in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Okay, so there's the sit-ins. Here's a clip on the Freedom Riders.
By the late 19th century, segregation of blacks and whites had become an entrenched way of life in the South. In December 1960, another Supreme Court ruling declared segregated restrooms, restaurants, and waiting rooms for interstate bus, train, and plane passengers unconstitutional. 5 months later, that law would be severely tested by Freedom Riders. The Freedom Rides were organized by James Farmer, director of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, a civil rights organization rooted in the philosophy of nonviolence. Farmer, who would be arrested with other Freedom Riders, launched the movement to draw attention to the lack of enforcement of recent civil rights court decisions and legislation. As Farmer's volunteers rode into the South, the campaign gained support from civil rights leaders like Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr. When the riders arrived in Atlanta, King praised them for their nonviolent, direct action, but he warned of trouble ahead. "You'll never make it through Alabama," he predicted. Activist John Lewis, now a congressman from Georgia, was then a 21-year-old divinity student. He was the first of the Freedom Riders to be attacked when he and a fellow white rider tried to enter a whites-only waiting room at a Greyhound terminal in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Traveling deeper into the South, to Mississippi and Alabama, singing spirituals and freedom songs, the riders were met with hostility, arrest, and more violence. One of the most frightening attacks occurred a few miles outside Anniston, Alabama, on May 14, 1961. A Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders was forced off the road by a white mob who stoned and firebombed the bus. The passengers barely escaped the burning vehicle. That same day, several of the Freedom Riders arriving at the Trailways bus depot in Birmingham suffered savage and bloody assaults. Among several beaten by the Ku Klux Klan was 61-year-old Walter Bergman, a college professor from Detroit. Undaunted, he urged others to join the cause and strike while the iron is hot. His fellow writer, Reverend B. Elton Cox, an outspoken minister from North Carolina, also remained defiant, saying he preferred death to segregation. Jim Swerg, a 21-year-old studying to be a congregational minister, was the victim of an ambush attack a week later at the Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, Alabama. Screaming, "Nigger lover," the mob pummeled him, fracturing his teeth and injuring his back. Trained in nonviolence, like his co-writers, he never struck back. As the vicious attacks on the Freedom Riders continued, the National Guard was called out. When hundreds of supporters of the Freedom Rides assembled at Montgomery's First Baptist Church with Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, an angry mob gathered outside. The National Guard patrolled the besieged church during the long, tense night. At times, however, Lewis recalled, the guards, with their bayoneted rifles, looked like the enemy. With their presence, the violence was quelled, but hostility awaited the riders as they arrived in Jackson. When black riders tried to enter a white waiting room, or white riders tried to use facilities designated for blacks, local police officers ordered them out. If the riders refused to leave, they were immediately arrested and charged with breach of peace. As the Freedom Riders were taken into custody in Jackson, they did not resist. Some bailed out of jail, but many, in a show of commitment to their cause, refused to be bailed out. The jail, no bail tactic, adopted by scores of those arrested, would burden Mississippi's penal system for months. Here's Martin Luther King, Jr.
Never in the history of this nation have so many people been arrested for the cause of freedom and human dignity.
While hundreds of Freedom Riders endured hot, dirty prison cells, civil rights leaders appealed to Washington. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had hoped for a quick end to the protests, and especially the violence. Finally, Kennedy pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission, the agency that regulated interstate travel, to issue a new and stronger ruling banning segregated facilities. The ruling went into effect on November 1st, 1961. It would still be many years before segregation would end completely, but the Freedom Riders had won a major battle in the war against racism.
Alright, one more video.
I'm Ozzie Smith. I played for the Cardinals for 15 years.
That's my favorite
I retired in
Cardinal,
1996.
by the way. I'm just going to say it.
Luckily made it to the Hall.
March on Washington.
August 28, 1963. 250,000 Americans, black and white, young and old, descend on the nation's capital in a show of solidarity. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but it would be remembered as a turning point in the fight for civil rights. Among the speakers, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who electrified the crowd with his stirring "I Have a Dream" speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
A few months earlier, racial tensions in the Deep South had erupted. News reports carried brutal images of fire hoses blasting at the backs of school children. President Kennedy had finally seen enough. In June of 1963, he presented sweeping civil rights legislation to Congress. Dr. King and others hoped a massive yet peaceful demonstration in Washington would spur passage of the bill. The city braced for violence, but their fears proved unfounded. The day of the march, more than 200,000 people gathered for a rally at the Washington Monument. It was the largest demonstration in the country's history. Arm in arm, they walked from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, performers as diverse as Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson lent their voices to the cause. Martin Luther King Jr. was the last to take the stage. He began with a reference to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves a century earlier.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Partway through, King put aside his prepared text and shared with the protesters his dream of equal rights for all.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spirit of free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
All right, guys. Well, that's going to wrap it up. That is the Civil Rights Unit. And like I said, I'm probably going to have some more assignments related to the Civil Rights Movement. Be on the lookout for that. Tomorrow, I want you guys to get caught up. Tomorrow is a catch-up day. Email me if you have any concerns, any questions, or any comments. You can also leave comments on Google Classroom. Now, there will be some updates coming your way after we come back from Easter break. Guys, be safe. Make good decisions. Wash your hands, okay? And make sure you're following the stay-at-home order. I'll see you guys later and be safe.